So it's, every September 11th, it's sort of hard to believe that this, we're another year further away from those events, and 13 years, more than a dozen years now, away from those events. And, having worked on this project, this September 11th Digital Archive, I never seem to be looking for a speaking engagement on 9/11. Every year I come back to this topic, so and every year I have a little bit more perspective on it, and but it never fully, you never kind of fully get your hands around how big those events were as they were happening. And so I think, for me at least, I think it's healthy to get back into that mindset. So I thank you all for having me here to do that today. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about how the web has changed in the dozen or so years since we started the September 11th Digital Archive. I guess it's been a dozen years since we launched it in 2002. And in this age of social media, in the age of Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram, I think it's hard for us to put ourselves back into a place, even though it's only been a decade or so, it's hard to put ourselves back into that place when the web was more or less a one-way communications platform. There was a lot of talk about interactivity around the turn of the millennium, but in the late 1990s and early 2000s, the web really was still a place where people went to read the news, to consume information, not so much to post information and materials or thoughts and stories of their own. The things we do on the web, what we feel like the purpose of the internet, what the internet is for now, like Facebook. For a lot of people, Facebook is the internet. Those kinds of interactions, those postings of thoughts and photographs, didn't really occur for most people online. The idea that anyone could mount a website didn't mean that everyone did mount a website. It just wasn't that easy. And so the web was still, in large part, a read-only as opposed to a read-write medium. And it was in that social media, that digital media environment, that colleagues of mine at the Roy Rosenzweig Center for History and New Media and the American Social History Project at the University of New York set out to convince members of the general public, this public that wasn't familiar with this process of uploading things to the web, for whom that wasn't an everyday occurrence. It was in that environment that we set out to convince people to contribute their digital images, their videos, and their personal narratives, their first-hand recollections, to an online archive in the aftermath of 9/11. That archive you can still find it at 911digitalarchive.org, the September 11th Digital Archive. And the September 11th Digital Archive was born out of earlier work in the late 1990s. The Sloan Foundation had been funding a set of projects that were aimed at using the internet to collect and preserve the history of science. Sloan Foundation funds mainly science and technology, also the history of science and technology. And Sloan was concerned about the proliferation of scientific work, scientific data, scientific research in the digital age, just how much was being produced, how many more people were being employed, how many more stories they were creating, how much more product there was to collect. Sloan had a long history of supporting oral history of scientists and engineers, and that position of supporting oral history of scientists, of long-form, kind of traditional oral history with full transcripts, long, sometimes day-long, weekend-long, week-long interviews with scientists and engineers, was starting to seem untenable in a digital age where there were more scientists, more work. You just couldn't you couldn't collect the whole field. And so Sloan was interested in using the internet to somehow kind of lower the cost, to lower the overhead of some of that collecting work that they had done that they had funded previously. And so they were thinking, well, can we use the internet to reach out to people, to have them contribute their stories directly rather than sending people on planes with recorders and doing this kind of long formal history. And so they funded a series of experiments at a bunch of different universities under this banner. And one of those experiments was the ECHO program at George Mason, exploring and collecting history online, where we were tasked to build new tools, experiment with new methods, and to teach students how to start to collect history online, collect narratives, images, other things using these web technologies. Now, so that experiment had been underway for a couple of years when 9/11 occurred. And being a New York foundation, even though sort of somewhat outside of their science and technology remit, Sloan thought that it had a responsibility to do something, a lot, in the wake of September 11th. And so they funded a series of projects, some of them, most of them, relief, recovery efforts for victims' families, etc. But one of them was this September 11th digital archive, building on earlier work that they funded, to borrow some of the methods that we developed in this, of course, this ECHO project to collect born digital materials. And when I say born digital, I mean things that were created on computers. Born digital, so not scans of things that were created in the analog world, but born digital materials related to terrorist attacks in New York, Virginia, and Pennsylvania. So, things like emails, instant messages, voicemails, typewritten stories, digital photographs, digital photography was just becoming a thing right around 2001. People were starting to have a camera in their pocket that could hold lots and lots of images that could be relatively easily uploaded to their computer and then to the internet. Digital artwork. This was the age when something called Photoshop finally made it onto people's home computers, so that digital image editing and then in turn digital video editing was something that people could do on kind of an ordinary consumer-grade laptop or desktop. So there's kind of market penetration of these digital editing tools. So those kinds of materials we set out to collect. Now, of course, we weren't the only ones to recognize the need to document the digital record of September 11th. In many ways, 9/11 was the first major historical event of the internet age. It was certainly the biggest event of the internet age to date. And museums and libraries and cultural institutions around the world realized that the digital record of 9/11 was going to be just as important as the analog record of 9/11, and that it was especially fragile, that it needed to be collected, that memories fade, emails deleted, word processor documents are trashed, hard drives crash, digital stuff goes away. Well, we thought digital stuff goes away. Now we sort of know better. Everybody was worried in 2000 that digital stuff would disappear. Now we know all too well that digital stuff never disappears, and we're all victims of it. Jennifer Lawrence is one of those victims. But we thought that it was, the field knew that this would be an important part of the historical record of these events. And yet in the end, the sort of established collecting institutions ended up being somewhat paralyzed by their own professionalism. People with library science, information science degrees, archival science degrees, almost knew too much to be effective collectors of the materials. They were worried about things like standards and metadata standards and privacy and emulation and migration. How are people going to read these things years on? They were worried about information architecture, database structures. And that knowledge made it very difficult, and those were all open issues. No one had any idea really how to collect and preserve. Still, really don't have any idea how to preserve born digital materials. But that kind of all of those unknowns prevented the field from really acting. And so, in the first year after 9/11, in that kind of crucial year when everybody still had everything on their hard drive, like the pictures they had taken, the things they had kind of downloaded from the internet were all sort of still on the hard drive. They hadn't kind of gotten a new computer or decided to make space for more music or whatever they wanted to do. In that kind of crucial year, the established players, the Library of Congress, the New York Historical Society, they had a lot of working groups and a lot of discussions, but there was not actually a lot of collecting going on in that what really turned out to be a pretty small window of opportunity for collecting these born digital materials. As a team of historians, of course, we had none of that professionalism. We had none of that baggage. We were blissfully unaware of the archival challenges. So we were kind of unhindered in our efforts. We just kind of went out there and decided to put out a call. We could, for people to contribute stuff. We at first asked for images, emails, and stories. People ended up contributing a lot more than that. All kinds of other digital products. But we were able because we didn't know better, and now I do, and it scares me to think of how cavalier we were. But we were able to move quickly, and the result is that we were able to collect something north of 150,000 more digital objects related to September 11th. We had a kind of strategy of the perfect is the enemy of the good. That was our catchphrase. That we would collect stuff, we would give it some metadata, whatever minimal metadata we could find. We would put it in a database. We wouldn't worry too much about how that database was structured, and then somebody else would figure out the 100-year problem for us. And I think there's a lesson in that for today, for collecting institutions. And I'll come back to that lesson later. So we did. We collected, and I should say, we're relaunching just today a new version of the archive's front-end interface. And actually, the front-end interface hasn't changed that much. The back-end interface has changed a lot. We've upgraded it, taking into account all those things like metadata standards, redundancy, and all the things we did take into account earlier. It only took us 13 years. But we collected 150,000 digital objects, nearly every file type, media format, digital photographs, as I said, digital artworks, multimedia animations, video games, little flash video games of where you could go in and shoot Osama bin Laden, a lot of that kind of stuff. Chat room conversations, and thousands of personal narratives, people telling their story of the experience of the aftermath of September 11th and their kind of personal witness of it. Now, that the quality of those materials is incredibly mixed. There's a whole lot of, somewhat, I don't want to say banal, but kind of uninteresting stories about. I was sitting with my husband watching the Today Show, and then the tower, the flame at the tower, a lot of that. And so at a kind of unit level, an individual item level, a lot of the sources in the archive aren't that interesting. But what's interesting about the digital is that on aggregate, they start to become more interesting. So for instance, the Today Show plays an outsized role in people's experience of 9/11. We can see that because we can mine the data. We haven't done a lot of that work yet, that analysis work, but it's in there. And so the hope is, I think, for some of these things where at an individual level they're not that interesting, on the aggregate they will be more useful to future cultural historians and others. We collected objects from something north of 50,000 individual contributors. We did, a lot of those were spontaneous contributions. People just came to the website and uploaded stuff. Some of it was targeted outreach to underrepresented communities. So, for instance, we had lots and lots of spontaneous stories from like investment bankers who were working in Lower Manhattan, right? We didn't have very many spontaneous stories from people who were also in Lower Manhattan at the time, Chinese speakers in Chinatown, for obvious reasons. And so we did a kind of concerted outreach program to those communities to try to have some more representation. Arab Americans, another group that were underrepresented on the whole, we did outreach to. So we did a kind of mixed program of kind of encouraging sort of wholesale contributions to the archive through the web interface, and then some targeted outreach where we would actually go encourage communities and show them how to use it, and have them tell their stories on the web. And it's now one of the largest collections of materials related to 9/11. And in 2003, it was acquired by the Library of Congress. This was our hoped-for solution to that 100-year problem as its first foreign digital acquisition. So that's sort of how the archive was born and what it sort of does and what it did. Give you a little bit of the flavor of the kinds of things that are in the archive. So, of course, there are eyewitness accounts and images from the day that were contributed by people who were at Ground Zero, people who were in Manhattan, people who were in Northern Virginia, from their families, from first responders, and from other people sort of directly affected or who directly witnessed the attacks. This was taken from an NYU dorm room by a student there. So again, people who worked at Ground Zero, we have lots of images of firefighters and those kinds of things. This was taken from someone at the Watergate Hotel. We have lots of those kinds of images. We have, but that was not our focus. Because there are in the photo wars of newspapers and in the archives of broadcast television, plenty of images of the day of 9/11. We were more interested, in fact, in the kind of aftermath of 9/11, and we have more images of that aftermath. Work of recovery crews at Ground Zero, posters for the missing, people who took photos of these posters that popped up around Manhattan. And most especially, memorials, kind of impromptu memorials from around the world. This is one from Germany. So this kind of cultural response to the attacks. And looking back, I sort of see some similarities in the way people used this website with how they used the chain link fence after Oklahoma City, or the way they used the fence at Kensington Palace after Princess Diana's death, where it was kind of a place to hang little mementos. And so the kind of memorial tropes that were enculturated after those earlier events were kind of brought forward into the internet age in this archive. And it's an amazing record of all of that, and it's really a record for the most part of that first year after 9/11, leading up to the first anniversary, where there was again this huge outpouring. Our servers crashed. We were serving, which at the time seemed like a lot to us. We were serving a couple thousand concurrent users of the website all day. So there were at any one time 1,500, 1,800 people using the website on one day. On that day of the first anniversary, we collected somewhere more than 10,000 objects just on that one day. So leading up to that, and but then after that first anniversary, we were sort of bright. It fell off, right? The interest fell off. Every year there's a bump on the anniversary where people still will come and contribute something. Certainly we get more traffic to the archive on every anniversary, but after that first anniversary, it was a sharp drop off, and it continued to drop off. So looking back, and as I said, this talk has given me an opportunity to kind of look back at this collection and sort of ask, what was that good for? And what can it tell us about that day, about digital culture, about ourselves? And one of the things that has stood out to me in looking at this in recent weeks is sort of just how much of later social media culture is present in the archive. That even though people weren't already used to using Facebook didn't exist, right? YouTube didn't exist. Even though people weren't used to using the internet in that read-write way, in that way of posting their own materials, they were starting in this archive to do some of the things that we see today in those social media. So, user-generated content. I mean, I think this is one of the first what will be permanent records of this phenomenon of user-generated digital content. These are, and there's a ton of this kind of stuff, Photoshopped images. So this is, this Photoshopped image of the Iwo Jima Memorial with the firefighters raising the flag at Ground Zero. There's actually a lot. What's interesting from a sort of public historian's perspective is that there's a lot of images of people trying to put these events through digital artwork in historical perspective. So there's a lot of kind of mashups of, there'll be a World War I victory poster with the Twin Towers photoshopped over it, or there will be an image of the pyramids at Giza with photoshopped towers behind them. A lot of that kind of stuff, where people are trying to kind of place this event within their own sort of view of significant events or monuments of the past. So there's a lot of that, and that's really interesting. But other kinds of things. Lots of what we would kind of recognize today as selfies, right? This thing where people have these images of themselves at the site prior to the fall of the towers that they contributed. This kind of new, very present art form, the selfie. Lots of animated GIFs. This is something we see shared on social media today, and people were building these little animations and sharing them on the September 11th Digital Archive, even in 2001 and 2002. And of course, lots of cats. Another very familiar internet trope. Lots of cats, with halos above the World Trade Center. There's something about cats in the internet. You'd have to be, psychologist, sociologist. It's out of my field of expertise, but there are lots of them. So So in terms of the format, people were doing a lot of the same kind of work in Photoshop and sharing within the archive that people are now doing in iMovie and sharing on YouTube today. In terms of content, most of the content, the themes of this user-generated content in the archive has to do with, I would kind of put it into two categories: anger and loss. See a lot of this. See a lot of the angry or vengeful eagle. And a lot of it gets like way more violent than this. There's some things. There's a lot in the archive that is violent, sort of violent video games of shooting Osama bin Laden, things that are kind of blatantly racist. On the other side, things that are wildly anti-Semitic and conspiracy-laden theories about Israel. So it's all kind of there. All of that is in there. And that actually too is very reflective of the kind of internet culture, where there's certainly a voice of the fringe in this archive. So anger and vengeance are very much very present in the archive, but even more so, I would say, is loss. And this is very common. There's a lot of images like this where people using Photoshop to try digitally to put the towers back. You see this over and over and over again. People trying to kind of put these towers back in place. That gives you just a sort of sense of what's in there. It's pretty interesting to flip 13 years later. So the other legacy of this work is that the archive inspired other efforts, related efforts, in the same vein. Both our own, this is another project that we launched after Hurricanes Katrina and Rita in 2005. We took advantage of some new technologies. We had a map, we had metadata, we understood a little bit more about good archival practice. Inspired sort of tragedy-based collecting projects. Sorry. So this is an archive that was launched after shootings at Virginia Tech, and we continue to see projects like this spring up. Some people may be familiar with Omeka. Omeka is a content management system for collections-based websites. So it's a way to build published collections-based work on the web. If you want to write text, you have a blog. If you want to publish collections, you want to use Omeka. Omeka is a software product, an open source software product that we built based kind of on lessons learned from these projects. And in fact, it was originally intended as a way to kind of quickly spin up online collecting projects. It's gone in other directions since, but originally it was very much based in this collecting mode of practice. And it's being used, as I said, it's being used today for this original online collecting purpose. This is an archive launched by WBUR, the public radio station in Boston, and colleagues at Northeastern University, to collect, again, this tragedy-based material. It occurs to me, though, and I wonder now, how much we really need dedicated collecting portals and websites like the September 11th Digital Archive, like the Hurricane Archive, like this Our Marathon project, which is a good project and has collected a lot. How much we really need these dedicated sites, though, in today's technical and cultural environment. As I said, we now live in a media environment where everybody's sharing everything all the time, right? You don't have to convince anybody to upload an image, right? We really would have to, sometimes convince people that this is okay, you can do this, even just at the level of okay, now it's gonna, now when you click this button, it's gonna bring up, your Windows Explorer window, and here's where you find the file, and here's how you upload it. I mean, that was all sort of foreign to lots and lots of people. Not foreign anymore, right? Everybody does this. Everybody's on Facebook. A billion people are on Facebook, sharing photos all the time. So in this new media environment, do we need dedicated places to collect, right? This is exactly the kind of thing that we have in September 11th, this image of consultant. And now you put it on Facebook. And is it worth our efforts to try to get people off of Facebook, or to convince people to post in both places, so that they're doing it on Facebook, but that they're also kind of contributing it to a dedicated archive, which is run by academics or collections professionals, and is going to be that has some promise of future preservation. Or would a better strategy just be to figure out ways to collect Facebook, and to collect Twitter, and to collect YouTube? I think that's an open question. It's not a question, again, that has gone unasked by the archival community. In 2010, the Library of Congress announced that it had come to an agreement with Twitter to preserve its database of status updates. The problem is, here's my lesson that I promised, is that the library, in many respects, once again, has been sort of paralyzed by its own professionalism, by the kind of laudable but crushing attention that it feels that it needs to pay to standards and data structures and privacy and context. And what about the attachments that are held on other services? And what about links to things that are now dead? And all of those questions, which are incredibly important questions to solve, right? And impossibly difficult questions for my historian's brain. But they're paralyzed. So 3 years after, almost 4 years after their agreement with Twitter, the library still doesn't have this stuff, really. It hasn't figured out how to accession it. It's written a white paper, right? There's a white paper detailing all these horrible problems. And it has advanced, I think, that research, and I'm friendly with people who've done that. It's advanced our understanding of library science, and it has, and they're doing amazing work in the field. But there still really isn't a workable Twitter archive that people can go to and use and search and do research. It doesn't exist. So here's the lesson. I'm not saying that the library and collecting institutions, serious professionals, shouldn't be grappling seriously with all those questions. these kind of big, important archival challenges of archiving social media. They should be. I'm glad they are. And I'm glad they were when we were launching the 9/11 project. But in the meantime, in addition to the kind of elegant solutions and kind of long-term preservation and collection strategies that the professionals are coming up with, I think that we, historians, but also librarians, archivists, museum professionals, have to be thinking about the quick and dirty solutions, the good enough solutions, not the perfect, the go out and get it done kind of solutions, before things fall offline. So there are, and I haven't thought at length, and maybe we can talk about this afterwards, about how to do this. One idea is like Storify. So Storify is a service where you can basically create a collection of tweets. You tag tweets, and you can put them into a timeline and publish that as a document of a Twitter conversation that's happening. Maybe we should be at the kind of one-off local level, the level of the individual event, collecting social media, building imperfect but present and immediately available materials, things that we don't, that we can maybe save later on when a better solution comes along. I'm sure there are other solutions, but that's just one idea that maybe rather than trying to solve the big Twitter problem, how do you save all of Facebook, which is, a third of the internet? Why don't you just try to save a few things that are kind of smaller bits, easier, quicker, dirtier ways that will be imperfect, but actually happen. Because I think the important thing to note about this is that making these quick and dirty archives and making them immediately available to a public isn't just about preservation. It's not just about the long term. It's not just about collections. Right? Doing these things can help collecting institutions fulfill other parts of their mission. So in the aftermath of 9/11, the archive served an important function in kind of collecting materials for future scholarship and all of that. And I think it did. But mainly, it served an important function in helping people deal with their grief, their anger, their loss, and giving them a place to share, of validating their kind of complex response to these world-changing events, of helping them to heal. And so I hope and I believe that the archive will be preserved in perpetuity and be a resource for future scholarship and policy making and other important high-minded uses. But I think that if it disappears tomorrow, it still will have done its